The morning sun hung low, casting a soft glow over the busy streets of the city. People walked hurriedly, each absorbed in their own world. As the hum of the city filled the air, among the crowd, a man stood out, not for his appearance, but for the way he carried himself. Calm, composed, yet with an intensity behind his eyes that only those who understood struggle could recognize. This was Malcolm, successful, focused, and quietly proud of his achievements. Malcolm had learned to navigate the world with care, always thinking before speaking, always weighing his actions. He knew that, in this society, his blackness would often be a target, a reason for others to underestimate him, judge him, or belittle him, but it never bothered him. He had grown accustomed to the whispers, the stares, the subtle dismissals. He had learned to rise above it, or at least, that was what he told himself. But that morning, as he walked down the street, everything felt different. The air was thick with tension, a storm just waiting to break. As he passed a group of police officers standing on the corner, one of them, a man with a stern face and a gleaming badge, caught his eye. "Hey!" the officer called out, his voice sharp, cutting through the bustling noise of the street. "Where do you think you're going?" Malcolm's body stiffened, but he kept walking, ignoring the officer's taunts. He had no intention of engaging with him, but the officer wasn't having it. "I'm talking to you." The officer's voice rose, now commanding attention. "You don't belong here. Move along." Malcolm stopped. His mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. He had dealt with this before, police officers who thought they could control everything, including him. But today was different. There was something in the air, something more dangerous about the way the officer spoke to him. "I'm just walking," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Yeah, right. You think you can just walk through here? Ooh, like you're one of us?" Malcolm's heart pounded in his chest. His mind flashed with memories of past encounters, those times when silence hadn't been enough, when his very existence had been treated as a challenge. The weight of history pressed down on him. "You don't belong here," the officer repeated, taking a step closer. "This area is for people who know how to act." Malcolm knew that this was the moment. He could feel the tension building, the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but he didn't react. He wouldn't give the officer the satisfaction of a confrontation. Not here, not now. But the officer wasn't finished. He moved even closer, towering over Malcolm, trying to intimidate him with his presence. "I said, move along," he growled, his breath hot on Malcolm's face. The crowd around them had begun to notice. Some people glanced over, curious, while others quickly turned their attention elsewhere, pretending not to see. But Malcolm could feel their eyes on him, judging, calculating. The officer's words felt like a public execution, the kind of silent cruelty that never seemed to end. "I'm not going anywhere," Malcolm said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his years of experience with this kind of treatment. The officer's eyes narrowed, and a sick smile crept across his face. "I'll make you go," he said, his hand slowly drifting to his belt. "You don't get to decide." Malcolm stood his ground. He could feel the anger building in him, but he refused to let it out. He had seen what happened to men like him who lost control. He had seen the brutality, the injustice, the pain. He would not let it happen today. But the officer was relentless, and in a flash, he pushed Malcolm, hard, sending him stumbling backwards. The world seemed to slow as Malcolm's feet lost their footing, but he quickly regained his balance. The crowd was silent now, watching with bated breath. Malcolm could feel the heat rising in his chest, the rage boiling just beneath his calm exterior. The officer had crossed a line, but Malcolm refused to take the bait. He took a deep breath, his mind clearing as he centered himself. "I'm not your target," Malcolm said, his voice low, steady, yet firm. "I'm not your enemy." The officer's face twisted in anger, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might escalate the situation further, but then he hesitated. Something in Malcolm's demeanor, the quiet strength radiating from him, caused the officer to falter. The moment stretched on, the tension thick in the air, and then, without another word, the officer stepped back, his eyes still burning with resentment. "Get out of my sight," he spat, turning and walking away. Malcolm stood there for a moment longer, his body still tense, his heart still racing. He didn't know whether to feel relieved or angered. The encounter had ended, but the sting of the officer's words lingered in the air, like smoke that refused to dissipate. As Malcolm continued on his way, the weight of the incident followed him. It was another day, another small battle fought, but it wasn't over. The reality of living in a world where his existence was still questioned, where his worth was still doubted, hung heavy on his shoulders. And yet, despite it all, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The officer's words were not just an isolated incident. They were part of a much larger system, one that had been in place long before Malcolm had been born, one that had shaped every part of his life. And one that, he realized, was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one merging into the next in a haze of quiet frustration. Malcolm tried to shake off the encounter with the officer, but it clung to him like a shadow, always there, just out of sight, waiting to remind him of the world he lived in. No matter how much success he achieved, no matter how many barriers he broke, these moments of racial aggression were reminders that he could never truly escape the limitations society imposed upon him. That night, as he sat at home, the weight of the day settled on him. His apartment was quiet, the hum of the city outside barely audible through the thick windows. He stared at his phone, the screen flickering in the dim light, but he didn't pick it up. The silence around him seemed louder than any noise could be. His mind wandered back to the officer, their brief exchange that had felt so trivial at the time. But it wasn't trivial. It was an assault on his dignity, an attempt to strip him of his humanity with nothing more than a few words and an oppressive stare. And it wasn't the first time. Malcolm knew what it meant to fight for respect, to earn every inch of space he occupied. He had climbed the corporate ladder, faced countless challenges, and broken through barriers in his professional life. Yet every time he stepped out of the office, he was reminded that none of that mattered when it came to the color of his skin. His achievements didn't shield him from the harsh judgment of society. In fact, the more he rose, the more it seemed to anger those who believed they had the right to judge him. The officer's words echoed in his mind, "You don't belong here." It wasn't just the officer's judgment of him, it was the system's judgment, a system that made it clear that no matter how far he went, Malcolm would always be seen as an outsider in certain places, and it pained him deeply. He had worked so hard, pushed through so many doors, only to be reminded that there were limits that others never had to face. But even as these thoughts circled through his mind, Malcolm could feel the resolve settling in. He would not let this be the defining moment of his life. He would not let this officer, or anyone, decide who he was or where he could go. It was time for him to take control of his narrative, to step into a space where his voice could be heard in a way that would make others take notice. The next day, he made a decision. He would move forward in a way that no one could ignore, no one could silence. He had been offered a position with the police department, an executive role that could put him at the forefront of the very institution that had tried to break him down. It was a strange thought at first, but it was one that made sense. Malcolm realized that if he truly wanted to see change, he needed to be in a position of power. He needed to understand the system from the inside, even if it meant confronting his own discomfort. As he sat in his office, contemplating the offer, Malcolm thought about the officer, his arrogance, his sense of superiority. The man hadn't just attacked him that day. He had attacked everything Malcolm stood for: his right to walk down the street without fear, his right to exist in a world that often wanted him to shrink into the shadows. That officer didn't know who Malcolm was. He didn't know the battles he'd fought to get to where he was. And in that moment, Malcolm knew he had to use the power he now had to reshape that narrative. The interview was a formality. The city was in desperate need of someone like Malcolm in the department, someone who understood both the community and the power structures within it. The police chief, an older man with a tired face, sat across from him, looking over his resume. There was a hint of skepticism in the chief's eyes, but there was something else too, something Malcolm recognized immediately. It was fear of change. "I've read your resume, Mr. Harris," the chief said, his voice dry, "but I need to ask, why the police? Why now?" Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Because if I'm going to change things, I need to be where the change is happening. I can't keep fighting from the outside. I've fought my whole life to get here, and I'm ready to make a difference." The chief didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, but Malcolm could tell that the skepticism remained. He wasn't expecting an immediate acceptance. The chief had seen the way things worked in the department, and he knew the odds. Malcolm would have to prove himself over and over again. But the idea of it, the thought of being in a place where he could finally make his voice heard, filled him with a strange sense of resolve. He wasn't just joining the force to be another cog in the machine. He was going to change it, from the inside out. Weeks later, Malcolm was standing at his new desk, looking out over the city. The weight of the responsibility was overwhelming, but he had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The first thing he'd done was call a meeting with the department's senior staff. He knew that if he was going to make an impact, It had to start with those who held power, those who had the influence to enact real change. But it wasn't the senior officers that Malcolm was most concerned with, it was the officers on the streets, the ones who harbored the same biases, the same prejudices that had nearly destroyed him. It was the ones who thought they could push people around because they wore a badge. He could see their faces, their arrogance, and he knew that change had to start with them. And yet, he couldn't escape the memory of the officer he had met on the street, the one who had dared to humiliate him, the man who had no idea that, in just a few months, he would find himself face to face with Malcolm again, only this time, it wouldn't be Malcolm on the receiving end of the disrespect. Malcolm smiled to himself as he sat down at his desk, the tension in his chest easing. He wasn't just playing the game anymore, he was about to change the rules. Malcolm's first few weeks in the department were filled with long meetings, impersonal procedures, and introductions to the senior officers he would be working with. But as the days passed, he began to sense the growing tension among the staff. Some respected his position, even if begrudgingly, while others couldn't hide their disdain. It wasn't just his skin color, they weren't used to someone like him in a place of authority. Malcolm was a man who had earned his place, not by playing the game, but by breaking it, and that made the older officers uncomfortable. But what they didn't realize was that Malcolm wasn't there to make friends. He wasn't there to play politics. He was there to make sure that no other person had to walk down the street and feel the weight of an officer's judgment, the sting of humiliation, simply for existing. As the days passed, Malcolm became more determined to make a change. He knew the path wouldn't be easy, and it wasn't. The old guard resisted, pushing back against every reform he tried to introduce. Some of the officers, like Sergeant Rick Calloway, a veteran of the force who had seen it all, were vocal in their objections. "You can't change the system from the inside," Calloway would sneer, his voice thick with cynicism. "This is the way it works. Harris, you're just wasting your time." But Malcolm had never been the type to back down from a challenge, especially not one as important as this. He began to speak out at every opportunity, advocating for body cameras for officers, implementing bias training, and creating programs for community engagement. He even pushed to increase diversity in the force, though he knew that would be the hardest of all to achieve. The system, he realized, wasn't just broken, it was built to keep people like him out. It was designed to suppress, to control. It wasn't until one late afternoon, when Malcolm was reviewing a report on police misconduct cases, that the first real test of his resolve arrived. He'd heard whispers of an incident involving one of his officers, Officer Jameson, a young cop known for his aggressive tactics and racial profiling. The reports were vague, but Malcolm knew better than to ignore them. He asked to see the bodycam footage. As he watched the video, his stomach churned. Officer Jameson was seen stopping a young black man walking home from a store. The man had done nothing wrong, he was just walking, minding his own business. But Jameson had approached him with a sense of superiority, demanding his ID without cause. The interaction escalated when the young man asked why he was being stopped. Jameson's response was brutal, with him slamming the man against a nearby wall, accusing him of being a gangster simply because of his appearance. It was clear from the video that the young man had done nothing wrong, and yet Jameson had treated him like a criminal from the moment they crossed paths. Malcolm felt a fire ignite inside him. This was what he was fighting against, the everyday abuses of power that went unchecked, the kind of police misconduct that created distrust between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to protect. He immediately called a meeting with his senior officers, including Calloway. The air in the room was thick with tension as Malcolm laid out what he had seen. "We need to take action on this," Malcolm said, his voice steady but firm. "Officer Jameson's behavior is unacceptable. He should be suspended while we investigate. This is exactly the kind of thing that damages the public's trust in us." Calloway's face hardened. "You can't just punish a cop based on a few minutes of footage. We don't know what happened before or after the recording. You can't jump to conclusions." Malcolm met Calloway's gaze, his eyes cold and unflinching. "This isn't just a few minutes of footage, Sergeant. This is a man's dignity. This is a pattern of behavior that's been going on for too long, and it needs to end now." There was a long silence before one of the younger officers, Officer Daniels, spoke up. "I agree with Harris. We can't just ignore this. If we want to change things, we have to start holding each other accountable." The room fell silent again, but this time, Malcolm could feel the shift. Not everyone was on his side, but there were enough who were starting to see what he saw. They knew that this wasn't just about one officer, it was about a system that allowed this kind of abuse to continue unchecked. Calloway scowled but didn't argue further. "Fine, "We'll investigate," he said gruffly, "but don't expect this to be easy." Malcolm nodded. "I didn't expect it to be." As he left the meeting, his mind raced. This was just the beginning. The real challenge was still ahead. Taking down one officer would send a message, but it wouldn't change the system. He needed to dig deeper, uncover the layers of corruption that had built up over the years. But as he walked through the halls of the station, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder. The officers he was working with, those who had held the reins of power for so long, were not going to let this go without a fight. And the ones he was trying to protect, the communities who had suffered under this system for years, were going to demand change, whether the department was ready for it or not. Malcolm's resolve had never been stronger, but with each step, he felt the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everything he had ever believed in, the idea that change was possible, even in the most corrupt of systems. But to bring about that change, Malcolm would have to confront not just the officers, but his own past, the painful memories of his own run-ins with the police, the years of humiliation, the fear of never being seen as anything more than a threat. He would have to face the truth of what it meant to fight a battle that wasn't just about him, but about the very soul of the nation. And deep down, he knew that the real fight was just beginning. Malcolm's investigation into Officer Jameson had set a dangerous precedent. The tension in the department was palpable as word of the investigation spread. Whispers turned into outright hostility, and the old guard began to push back harder than he had anticipated. Officer Calloway, despite his initial agreement to investigate Jameson, began subtly undermining Malcolm's authority at every turn. He was not alone. Several senior officers, who had long been entrenched in the system of corruption and bias, began to circle Malcolm, questioning his decisions and his commitment to the cause. But none of that mattered. Every day, as Malcolm sat in his office reviewing more complaints, more incidents of racial profiling, he was reminded why he was there. He wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was a symbol of resistance to the centuries-old system that had perpetuated inequality, brutality, and fear. But this resistance was not without cost. The backlash against Malcolm wasn't just internal. It soon became clear that there were people outside of the department who wanted to silence him as well. Late one evening, after a long day of meetings, Malcolm received a phone call from his wife, Claire. Her voice was frantic, more so than he had ever heard it before. "Malcolm, you need to come home, now." The urgency in her tone sent a wave of panic through him. "What's going on?" he demanded, already grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. "It's about the kids. There's been a threat," she said, barely able to choke out the words. "Someone came to the house, left a note. It's not good, Malcolm." Malcolm's heart dropped into his stomach, for all the personal pain he had endured over the years, for all the struggles he had fought through. Nothing prepared him for the thought of his family being dragged into this war he had chosen to fight. The weight of it crushed him. "I'll be home in 5 minutes, he said, his voice tight with worry, then quickly hung up the phone. The drive home felt endless. Every red light, every delay, seemed like it was slowing him down, making him feel more and more helpless. When he finally arrived at the house, Claire was standing at the door, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's not just a note, Malcolm," she said, taking his hand and leading him inside. "They know where we live. They know everything." Malcolm felt the floor fall from beneath him. Inside the house, a chilling reminder of the world he had chosen to confront awaited. A single piece of paper, left on their kitchen counter, was scrawled with a simple, terrifying message: "We know who you are, Malcolm. This will end with you, just like it did with the others." The note was signed with a symbol he didn't recognize, some kind of insignia, a shape that felt too familiar, yet too distant to identify. But the message was clear: someone, somewhere, was watching, and they were not afraid to act. The sense of vulnerability, of being targeted for simply trying to make a difference, hit Malcolm like a freight train. His family, the people he loved, were in danger. The pain of that realization was more than he could bear. He had put them in harm's way by pushing forward with his investigation, by trying to change the system, and now, the consequences were staring him in the face. "Malcolm, we need to leave. We need to go somewhere safe," Claire said, her voice trembling. He looked at her, torn between the impulse to protect his family and the relentless drive that had fueled him for so long. But deep down, he knew that running wouldn't solve anything. If he left now, if he allowed fear to dictate his next move, he would lose everything he had worked for. This fight was bigger than just him. It was about a future where his children wouldn't have to live in a world that judged them by the color of their skin. a world that could tear families apart with a whisper and a threat. "Claire, I can't. I won't let them win," he said, his voice firm. "We have to stay. We have to finish this." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she stepped closer to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "Malcolm, I love you, but I can't lose you. We can't lose you." The pain in her voice cut through him. It was the first time since he had taken this job that he truly questioned if it was worth it. Could he really keep fighting, knowing the dangers it posed to his family? He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady himself. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about everything that was at stake: the truth, the fight for justice, the future of his children. He had no choice. He couldn't back down. He had to make this fight count. For them, for Claire, for everyone who had been silenced by a system that favored power over people. But as the days wore on, the threats became more frequent, more direct. They were no longer just anonymous notes. His house was vandalized. His car was keyed. Late at night, he would hear strange sounds, footsteps outside, the shadow of a figure watching him through the windows. Someone wanted him to stop. Someone wanted him to fall. But each threat only made him more determined to push forward. And then came the breaking point. One night, as Malcolm was walking to his car after a late meeting, he was ambushed. A group of masked men jumped out from the shadows, pulling him into a dark alley. They beat him mercilessly, their fists pounding into his face, his chest, his ribs. The blows were not just physical, they were meant to break him, to crush his spirit, to send a message. "You think you can change things? You think you can bring justice to this city?" One of the attackers hissed as he slammed Malcolm against the wall. "This is what happens when people like you try to play with fire." Malcolm fought back, using every ounce of strength he had to free himself. But the attackers were relentless. They kept coming, the punches never stopping, until the world around him went black. When Malcolm woke up, he was in a hospital bed, his body bruised and battered. Claire was sitting beside him, holding his hand tightly, her face streaked with tears. "Malcolm," she whispered, "you're awake, thank God." But Malcolm didn't hear her. He didn't hear anything. His mind was consumed with a single thought: this is just the beginning. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, they were just the price of the fight. He had known it wouldn't be easy. He had known the system wouldn't give up without a fight. But now, he understood something deeper. The fight was far from over, and as long as he had breath in his body, he would keep fighting. Malcolm's recovery was long, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The attack had taken a toll on him in ways that he hadn't anticipated. He had always been prepared for the battle. He had been trained to expect resistance, to face obstacles, to meet aggression head-on, but nothing could have prepared him for the brutality of the attack, the sheer violence of it, and the realization that this was just one small part of a much larger, much darker system. When he was finally able to walk again, albeit with a limp, Malcolm returned to work. The wounds on his body were healing, but the scars left on his soul were more difficult to erase. Each step he took, each breath he drew, reminded him that he was not just fighting for a cause. He was fighting for his life, for his family, and for the future of those who had no voice. His office was quiet when he walked in, the usual buzz of phones and murmurs of conversations gone. He sat down at his desk, staring at the pile of reports and complaints that had accumulated during his absence. The weight of it all threatened to suffocate him, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. The department had been on edge ever since the attack. Rumors were flying, both inside the force and in the media. Some believed the attack was a warning for Malcolm to stop his reforms. Others thought it was a sign of something worse to come. But Malcolm didn't care about the rumors. What mattered now was the truth, and the truth was that he couldn't afford to let fear dictate his actions. He had to keep moving forward, even when the path seemed impossible. It was on his first day back that he received a call from an unexpected source. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, measured, and eerily familiar. "Malcolm," the voice said, "I think it's time we had a conversation." Malcolm's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Detective Raymond West, a high-ranking officer who had always been in the shadows, an enigma within the department. West had been a fixture in the force for as long as anyone could remember. He was known for his unyielding loyalty to the system, a man who had lived through every major scandal and emerged unscathed. "Detective West," Malcolm said, keeping his voice even, "what do you want?" "I think we both know why I'm calling," West replied, his tone still calm but tinged with a subtle threat. "You've stirred up quite a storm, Malcolm, and while I respect your determination, I need to remind you that you're stepping into a territory you don't fully understand. You're in over your head." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm not backing down." There was a pause on the other end, as if West was considering his words carefully. "That's what I thought you'd say. But let me be clear, Harris, the system doesn't change. People like you, people who try to take it all down, end up crushed. You've made enemies, and they won't stop until you're gone." Malcolm took a deep breath, his pulse racing. "Then they'll have to go through me, because I'm not going anywhere." There was a slight chuckle from West. "We'll see about that. I just wanted to give you a little warning. This isn't a game, and the more you push, the more you'll regret it." The line went dead. Malcolm stared at the phone for a moment, feeling a wave of unease wash over him. Detective West's words were more than just a warning, they were a threat. The power that West represented, the network of influence he controlled within the department, was a force to be reckoned with. And yet, the more Malcolm thought about it, the more resolute he became. This fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been marginalized, who had ever been oppressed, who had ever been treated like they didn't matter. Malcolm's first step was clear. He needed to gather more support, find those who were willing to stand by him and help bring change to the system. And he knew exactly where to start. He reached out to Officer Daniels, the young cop who had supported him from the very beginning. Daniels had proven himself to be different, someone who truly believed in the idea of a just and accountable police force. They had worked together on a few small initiatives, but now, with the weight of the department's corruption pressing down on them, Daniels would have to become more than just an ally. He had to be a partner in this fight. "Daniels, I need your help," Malcolm said when he called him the following morning. "We're going after the people who run this department, and I need you to be with me." "I'm in, Malcolm," Daniels replied without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Together, they began to form a small but dedicated team. It wasn't easy. They had to be careful. The eyes of the department were everywhere, and the people they were up against had the power to destroy them. But slowly, over the course of several months, they built a network of officers, detectives, and even civilian advocates who shared their vision for a better future. Malcolm knew that this wasn't going to be a quick battle. It was going to be long, drawn out, and brutal. But with each passing day, with each new ally they brought in, the walls of the department began to shake. The system, once so secure in its power, was beginning to show cracks. But that wasn't enough. Malcolm wasn't just fighting to expose corruption within his own department. He was fighting to create a ripple effect, one that would spread across the city, the state, and eventually the nation. He knew that real change would only come if they could make the people understand the truth that this wasn't just about a few bad cops. It was about a system that protected them, that shielded them from accountability, that allowed them to hurt people without consequence. Malcolm's next move was bold. He called a press conference, one that would publicly expose the department's failings, the corruption that ran deep within its ranks. It was a risky move, one that could either make or break him, but he was done playing it safe. As the press conference began, Malcolm stepped up to the podium, his heart racing. The eyes of the city were on him, waiting for him to speak. The world was about to know what had been going on behind closed doors, the truth that no one wanted to hear. But Malcolm was ready. But with that hope came a deeper understanding. The fight was far from over. What he had started could not be undone, but it would come with great cost. The forces against him were powerful, and their resistance would only grow fiercer. He knew that exposing the truth would not bring immediate relief or justice. It would ignite a war, one where every victory came with a price. The city would never be the same. The department would never be the same. And neither would he. But Malcolm Harris wasn't afraid. He had already paid too much to back down now. This was his moment, and he would keep fighting, no matter the cost, until justice was no longer just a dream, but a reality. As he left the podium and walked into the uncertain future ahead, Malcolm felt the weight of the city's eyes upon him. He had become their symbol of resistance, their symbol of hope. And though the road ahead was fraught with peril, he knew he would never stop fighting. This was just the beginning. "We are at a turning point," he began, his voice steady and strong. "What happens today will determine the future of this department. And make no mistake, the future starts now. We can no longer stand by and allow the system to operate in the dark. We must hold ourselves accountable, no matter the cost." As he spoke, Malcolm could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the beginning of the end for those who had built their power on lies, on abuse, on fear. The battle was far from over, but as Malcolm looked out at the sea of reporters, his resolve hardened. He had no choice but to fight on, for his family, for his city, for the truth. Malcolm stood at the podium, every word he spoke cutting through the tension in the room, reverberating beyond the walls of the press conference into the streets of the city. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't just his fight anymore, it was the city's fight. The people were listening. They were ready for change, ready to take on the corrupt system that had held them captive for so long. Malcolm walked away from the press conference with the weight of the city on his shoulders. The long road ahead was lined with dangers, with people who would stop at nothing to maintain the status quo. But for the first time in years, Malcolm felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known was possible. The fight for justice wasn't just his battle, it was shared by so many who had been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. As days turned into weeks, the backlash was fierce. The corrupt officers, the powerful figures who had been part of the system's deep roots, fought back harder than ever. Threats came in the dead of night, anonymous calls, whispered warnings, but each day, more and more officers, activists, and community leaders stepped forward, emboldened by Malcolm's courage. They knew the fight wasn't just for reform, it was for survival. In the midst of the struggle, Malcolm's family remained his anchor. His wife, his children, they reminded him why he had to keep going, why he couldn't give up. They were the reason he pushed through the pain, the danger, the sleepless nights. They were the light when everything seemed dark. Through it all, there were moments of victory, small, yet significant. An officer who had been complicit in the system came forward, ready to testify. A judge ruled against one of the most powerful corrupt officials in the department. And slowly, the public began to take notice. What once seemed like an impossible fight became a movement. The media coverage, the protests in the streets, the conversations at dinner tables, people were waking up. They were starting to see that the system was broken, and the voices of those who had been marginalized for so long were finally being heard. In the final moments of the story, as the department faced an inevitable overhaul, Malcolm stood in front of a crowd, this time not a press conference, but a rally of citizens, officers, and leaders from all walks of life. There was no more fear in his eyes, no more doubt in his heart. His struggle had brought them all together, and now the work was just beginning. The last words Malcolm spoke, as they echoed through the crowd, captured everything he had fought for. This is not the end. This is the beginning of the change we've been waiting for. We are here, we are strong, and we will never stop fighting for the truth. The crowd erupted in applause, and as the noise surged around him, Malcolm felt something he hadn't in a long time, a peace, knowing that despite the years of struggle and pain, the work had begun to bear fruit. For the first time in a long while, Malcolm could finally see a future, one where justice was not a distant hope, but a living, breathing reality. And with that, he walked off the stage, knowing that the fight was far from over, but no longer alone. The end.